You dial 3 numbers, and somewhere a machine starts moving toward you. Inside it are 2 people with a license, a defibrillator, oxygen, drugs, a radio link to a hospital physician, and a few thousand hours of training between them. They will start treating you on your own kitchen floor. By the time you reach the emergency room, a doctor there already knows your heart rhythm and your blood pressure, because they've been listening on the way in. That is what an ambulance means to you. It means the hospital comes to you first. Now put yourself in 1965 and dial for help. What arrives at your curb in more than half the country is a hearse, a long black Cadillac from the funeral home 3 streets over, driven by the undertaker or by whichever young man he could get out of bed. There is no medic aboard, there is no oxygen worth the name, no heart monitor, no radio to any doctor. There is a stretcher, and there is speed, and there is a man whose actual profession begins the moment you stop breathing. He is not a villain. In a small town, he was often the only man with a vehicle long enough to carry a body lying flat, and the only business open at 3 in the morning. But look at the arrangement without flinching. The person collecting you from the wreck makes his living from the dead. So how did the richest country on earth end up sending funeral directors to save lives? What actually happened to you in the back of that car? And why did it take until the 1970s, the decade of the moon landings, for America to build an ambulance service worth the name? We're going to read a government report that said an American soldier shot in the jungle had a better chance of living than an American driver hit on a highway at home. We're going to meet a doctor who taught the world to breathe for the dying and could not save his own daughter. We're going to meet the men who invented the paramedic, a crew of unemployed black men from a Pittsburgh neighborhood that the city had written off, and watch what the city did to them after they proved it worked. And we're going to find out why a television show did more for American emergency medicine than a decade of legislation. Because this isn't really a story about vehicles. It's about how long a country can look straight at its own dead and call it normal. Let's open the vault. The idea that a wounded man should be moved quickly is not old. For most of human history, if you fell in the street, you were carried indoors by whoever was nearby, and that was the whole system. The first American ambulance services grew out of the Civil War, where military surgeons learned something brutal and simple. Men who reached a surgeon in the first hours lived, and men who lay in the field died, no matter how good the surgeon was. Cincinnati put a civilian horse-drawn ambulance into service in 1865. Bellevue Hospital in New York followed in 1869, with a wagon carrying splints, bandages, and a quart of brandy. The Bellevue wagon is worth pausing on. The commissioners specified exactly what it carried, and the list survives. A quart flask of brandy, 2 tourniquets, half a dozen bandages, splints, and a stomach pump. A surgeon rode along. For 1869, that was a serious machine. But notice what it was: a fast horse and a box of supplies. Nobody was treating you. The vehicle existed to move you to the doctor, not to bring the doctor to you. Everything that happened to you happened after you arrived, and that one assumption, the ambulance is transport, not treatment, sat unchallenged in American medicine for the next 100 years. It is the reason everything else in this story went the way it did. By the early 20th century, cities had a patchwork of arrangements, and the patchwork is the point. Somewhere the hospital ran a wagon, somewhere the police did. The same wagon that hauled drunks to the cells hauled the bleeding to the hospital, and the officers driving it had no more medical training than the drunks. Elsewhere, the fire department took it on, or a volunteer squad, or nobody at all. No state law said a town must be able to reach a dying man. If your county had a service, that was luck. If it didn't, you drove yourself, or your neighbor drove you, or you waited. There is another absence hiding inside this one, and it is worth naming. There was no number to call. Until remarkably recently, there was no single emergency number in the United States. You called the operator and hoped she knew who to connect you to, or you looked up the police in the phone book. A different number in every town, another for the fire department, another for whichever ambulance service existed, if one did. In a strange town, a person could genuinely not know how to ask for help. The first 911 call in American history was placed at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 16th of February, 1968, in Haleyville, Alabama, a town of a few thousand people that beat the phone company's own pilot city to it by a matter of days. That is how recent the number is. Somebody watching this is older than 911, so picture the whole of it. No number to dial, no standard for who answers, no requirement that anyone come. And into that vacuum stepped an industry that was already awake at night, already had the vehicle, and already knew the way to the hospital. Here is the thing about a hearse. It is built around one requirement. It can carry a human body lying completely flat. That is also the central requirement of an ambulance. In the 1930s, funeral directors across America looked at the long vehicles sitting in their garage and drew the obvious conclusion. They were open 24 hours. They had a driver on call. They had a car that fit a stretcher, and half the time, the call ended at their own establishment anyway. So they went into the ambulance business, and the industry built them a machine for it. It was called a combination car. From the outside, it looked like a hearse, long, black, chrome-curtained windows. Inside, it could be switched from one job to the other in minutes. Pull out the casket rollers, drop in a cot, clip on a red light and a siren, and the funeral coach became an ambulance. Same car, same driver, same afternoon. Cadillac, Superior, Miller Meteor built them by the thousands, and for 4 decades they were a normal sight on American roads. The same firm sold the same chassis to both trades, and their catalogs advertised the conversion as a selling point. One vehicle, 2 revenue streams. By the 1960s, more than half the ambulances in the United States were hearses, station wagons, panel trucks, and vans, vehicles designed for cargo, converted for people who were dying. In a small town, this arrangement was total. The funeral home was the ambulance service, and there was no second number to call. If the undertaker was out on a burial, you waited until he was finished. Think about the call as it actually happened. Somebody wrecks a car on a country road. A passerby finds a telephone. The operator connects to the sheriff, and the sheriff runs his finger down a list on the wall and calls the funeral home, because that is who is on it. The undertaker pulls on his trousers, backs the combination car out, and drives to the wreck. The police help him load you in. That was standard practice. Officers routinely lifted the stretcher for the funeral director. And then you are in the back, alone, in the dark, on a mattress in a vehicle designed for a coffin, being driven fast by a man with no medical training at all. Nobody is holding your airway open. Nobody is stopping the bleeding beyond a pad and pressure, if that. If your heart stops on the way, nothing happens. There is nothing aboard that could restart it, and nobody aboard who would know how. The speed was the medicine. That was the entire theory of care. Get there fast and hope. Now hold the uncomfortable part up to the light. The man driving you had a business downstream of your outcome. I want to be fair here. The historical record does not show undertakers letting patients die for trade, and many of them were decent men doing an unpleasant job that nobody else would take, at hours nobody else would keep, often for no money at all. Small-town funeral directors ran ambulance calls as a public service for decades and lost money on it. But a system that arranges things this way is not a system. It is an absence, with a hearse parked in it. Ask the obvious question. Where were the standards? There weren't any. There was no federal requirement of any kind for what an ambulance had to carry, and none for what the person in the back had to know. No licensing, no certification, no minimum training, no inspection. In most states, the qualification to work on an ambulance was a driver's license and a willingness to show up. Equipment was whatever the operator felt like buying. Some carried oxygen, many didn't. A splint, a blanket, a bottle of something. There was no list because there was nobody to write one, and the vehicles themselves were built wrong on purpose. A hearse is designed to be low and elegant. The roof is close to the deck. You cannot kneel beside a patient in the back of one, and you certainly cannot stand, so nobody could work on you even if somebody aboard had known how. The design that made the car dignified for the dead made it useless for the living. Here's the detail that finishes the picture. The attendant, if there was one at all beyond the driver, rode up front. In a hearse, there is no room to sit in the back with the patient, so on the ride that decided whether you lived, you were by yourself behind a partition. This was not some forgotten corner of the country. This was normal in most of America within the lifetime of people watching this, and the consequences were specific. Think about what actually kills a person in the first minutes after an injury. It is a short list, and it has always been the same list. An unconscious person's tongue falls back and closes the airway. That is it. No wound, no bleeding, just a body lying on its back with the throat shut. It takes a few minutes. Turning the head and lifting the jaw fixes it, and in a hearse there was nobody in the back to do it. Bleeding kills by simple arithmetic. Pressure in the right place buys time, and no pressure means the arithmetic runs out on the ride. And a heart that stops in the first minutes can often be restarted, but only if somebody starts compressions immediately and a defibrillator arrives fast. In 1965, there was no defibrillator in that vehicle, there was no oxygen mask on your face, and the man who could have pushed on your chest was up front, driving. So the deaths were not mysterious. People died of things that a trained person kneeling beside them could have handled with their hands. The people who finally forced the issue were not politicians. They were surgeons, and a lot of them had learned their trade in uniform. Picture the position they were in. A man spends his war in a field hospital in Korea or Vietnam, where a wounded soldier is reached within minutes by a trained medic, flown out by helicopter, and on a table inside an hour. Then he comes home, takes a post at an American hospital, and stands in his own emergency room on a Saturday night, watching a farm boy die of injuries he had routinely saved men from overseas because nobody treated the boy for the 40 minutes it took a funeral car to reach him. Those men wrote it down. In 1966, the National Academy of Sciences published their document under a title that sounds like paperwork, Accidental Death and Disability, the Neglected Disease of Modern Society. Everyone in the field calls it the white paper, and it detonated, the numbers first. In 1965 alone, accidents produced 52 million injuries in the United States. 107,000 people were killed, 10 million were temporarily disabled, 400,000 were permanently disabled, for life. The bill came to $18 billion in the money of the day, then the sentence that made people put the report down. The authors observed that a soldier badly wounded in the jungles of Vietnam had a better statistical chance of surviving than a man injured in an automobile accident on an American highway. Read it again. The Army had learned the lesson. Trained medics at the point of injury, radio, helicopters, surgical care within the hour. That machinery was working, thousands of miles away, in a war. And a man hit on a road outside his own town got a hearse. The report was blunt about why. It found that the standards ambulance services were held to were wildly inconsistent and, in its own words, often low. It found that most ambulances in the country were unsuitable, that they had incomplete equipment, that they carried inadequate supplies, and that they were staffed by untrained attendants. It also said something harder. It said the public and the government were insensitive to the scale of the problem, that 100,000 deaths a year had simply been absorbed into the background of American life, the way weather is absorbed. Nobody was outraged because nobody had counted it in one place before. The white paper is the moment the counting happened. The report went further than diagnosis. It laid out what a country was supposed to have. Trained ambulance attendants with a defined curriculum, radio communication between the vehicle and the hospital, emergency departments that were staffed around the clock rather than whoever was on call, a national registry, regional trauma centers, and research into why injured people die. Read that list today, and it describes an ordinary Tuesday. In 1966, it described nothing that existed. The first real answer came from a place nobody in authority was looking. Pittsburgh's Hill District in the 1960s was a black neighborhood that the city had spent a decade dismantling. Thousands of people displaced for an arena and a redevelopment scheme, businesses gone, unemployment brutal. When someone in the Hill District needed help, the police came, if they came. They put you in the back of a wagon. There are accounts of officers refusing to take black patients at all. In 1967, a community organization called Freedom House Enterprises made a proposal that sounded absurd on paper: take unemployed and unemployable men from this neighborhood, men labeled by the city as untrainable, some with records, most without a high school diploma, and turn them into something that did not yet exist in America, not drivers, medics. Understand how that sounded at the time. Nobody was proposing better ambulance drivers. The proposal was to take people the employment office had classified as unplaceable and hand them the authority to put a needle in your arm and a tube in your throat, on the street, without a doctor present. There was no profession to hire them into because it did not exist yet. They would be the first. The city's own institutions were skeptical to the point of hostility. Some hospitals did not want them bringing patients in. There are accounts of officers refusing to work alongside them and of crews being waved off calls in white neighborhoods. They found the right teacher, and he is one of the most remarkable figures in American medicine. Peter Safar was an Austrian-born anesthesiologist who had come to the United States after the war. In the 1950s, he set out to test the resuscitation method every rescuer in the world was being taught, a business of lifting the victim's arms and pressing on their back with the body face down. To find out whether it worked, Safar recruited volunteers, gave them a curare-type drug that paralyzed them completely, and used them as stand-ins for the drowned and the dying. They were conscious. They could not breathe for themselves. Their lives were, for those minutes, entirely in his hands. What he demonstrated was that the accepted method did essentially nothing. Face down, the airway was blocked, and oxygen in the blood fell away within minutes. Then he breathed into their mouths and showed the levels holding steady. Combined with chest compressions, that was CPR, and it is the reason the technique exists at all. Every lifeguard, every flight attendant, every teenager in a school gym practicing on a plastic torso is downstream of those experiments. And then, in 1966, the same year as the white paper, the thing he had built a career on failed him at his own kitchen table. His daughter Elizabeth, 12 years old, had a severe asthma attack. Safar reached her. The man who had taught the world how to restart a stopped heart restarted his own child's. He got her circulation back, he got her breathing, but her brain had been without oxygen too long, and there was nothing in medicine that could undo that. Elizabeth died. He had proved that you can bring a body back. His daughter proved that bringing the body back is not the same as bringing the person back, and Safar spent the rest of his career on that gap, on the question of how to protect a brain in the minutes when everything else has stopped. Safar wrote a curriculum of roughly 300 hours: anatomy, airway management, defibrillation, drug administration, childbirth, trauma. It was, by an enormous margin, the most advanced pre-hospital training program in the world. Nothing like it existed for any ambulance crew anywhere, and the men from the Hill District passed it. Freedom House Ambulance Service went into operation with vehicles built to be worked in, with two-way radios to physicians, with EKG machines, with drugs, with oxygen and suction and intubation equipment. They were the first crews in the United States to arrive with the skills to treat you where you fell instead of hauling you somewhere to be treated. The results were not marginal. In their first year, they answered thousands of calls. Reviews of their work found care of a standard the city's police wagons could not approach, patients stabilized on scene, cardiac arrests worked properly, people who would have died in transit arriving alive. One of the men who came through that program was named John Moon. He had grown up in an orphanage, and he first saw a Freedom House crew while working as a hospital orderly, watching these medics walk in with patients they had already treated. He signed on at 22. Moon is credited with the first out-of-hospital endotracheal intubation performed by a paramedic in the United States, putting a breathing tube into a dying person's airway on the street at a time when American medicine considered that a hospital procedure for physicians only. Consider what that means. The first time anyone in this country secured a patient's airway outside a hospital, it was done by a man from a neighborhood the city had condemned, trained in a program the city had doubted, in a service the city would shortly shut down. Doctors came from other cities to watch. When the federal government began writing the national standard for paramedic training, it used the Freedom House program as its model. A group of men that a city had declared unemployable had just invented the American paramedic. And still, almost nothing changed nationally. The white paper was published. Freedom House was working. Congress had passed a Highway Safety Act that let Washington set ambulance standards on paper. But out in the country, the hearses kept rolling because the public did not know there was an alternative, and nobody was demanding one. Then, in January of 1972, NBC put on a show called Emergency. It followed two paramedics in Los Angeles County. Every week, tens of millions of Americans watched two men arrive at somebody's worst moment carrying equipment, start an IV in a living room, read a heart rhythm, talk to a doctor by radio, and drive away with a person who was still breathing. The country had never seen this. Most viewers had no idea it was possible, and in most of the country, it wasn't. People began asking their own city councils why the men who came to their houses could not do what the men on television did. The show was made by Jack Webb, the man behind Dragnet, and he ran it the way he ran everything, obsessively literal. Fire department consultants worked on the scripts, procedures were shown correctly and in sequence with the right equipment, and storylines came from real call logs. The audience wasn't being entertained by a fantasy of emergency medicine. They were being shown a documentary with actors in it. The effect is measurable. When the show premiered, Los Angeles County had a handful of paramedic units. Within a few years, it had many times that number, and county officials credited the show directly for the public support that paid for them. Across the country, departments traced their paramedic programs to the moment their voters started watching. There is a stranger effect still. People began saving each other. Viewers who had watched CPR performed correctly week after week started doing it, at pools, at dinner tables, on sidewalks, and hospitals began logging cases where a bystander with no training at all kept somebody alive because they had seen it done on a Saturday night. A network drama did what a National Academy of Sciences report could not. It made the absence visible. The law caught up in November of 1973 when Congress passed the Emergency Medical Services Systems Act. It put the federal government behind the problem with real money, up to $300 million for building regional systems, training, communications, and vehicles. It defined what an emergency medical service actually had to consist of. For the first time, an ambulance in America was a thing with a definition. Within a decade, the hearse was gone from the business, replaced by a tall, boxy vehicle you could stand up in, built, at last, around the idea that someone would be working on you inside it. The funeral homes did not fight to keep the work. Most of them were relieved to lose it. The new standards meant equipment they would have to buy, training they would have to pay for, and liability they did not want, all for a service most had been running at a loss for years. By the end of the 1970s, the combination car had essentially vanished from American roads, and an entire era of the funeral trade closed quietly, without anyone marking it. So the country got its ambulance service. Here is what it did to the men who built it. As Pittsburgh moved to create a citywide paramedic service in the mid-1970s, Freedom House, the most experienced and most decorated pre-hospital crew in the United States, was not made the core of it. The service was dissolved in 1975. Most of its medics were not carried over into the new city system. Some were told they would have to retrain. Several of the men who had written the standard the entire nation was adopting found themselves out of work, and the ambulances that replaced them were crewed largely by white paramedics with less experience. The idea survived. Most of the men who had it were discarded, but not all of them, and this is where the story turns. John Moon was one of the few who made it across. He kept the job, and then he kept going. He spent 35 years in the service that had absorbed his own, the same city, the same streets, the same neighborhood he'd been written off in. He built its first recruitment program. He retired in 2009 as an assistant chief of Pittsburgh Emergency Medical Services. The man who put the first breathing tube into a patient on an American street, who was trained in a program the city doubted, in a service the city shut down, ended his career running part of the department that replaced it. In recent years, he has sat as an invited guest at a president's address to Congress, telling the story of men whose names had been left out of it for 50 years. Now step back and look at the whole shape of it. For 100 years, the American answer to a dying man was a fast vehicle and good luck. It wasn't a conspiracy, and it wasn't stupidity. It was an absence everyone had learned to live beside, until somebody put the number of the dead on one page, and until a television camera showed Americans, week after week, a version of help that already existed and that they did not have. The system that came out of it is now so ordinary that it is invisible. More than 18,000 local agencies answer emergency calls in the United States, running something close to 73,000 vehicles between them. The equipment in the back of one of those would have been science fiction to a hospital in 1965, let alone to a man driving a converted hearse down a country road, and the gap that started it, the difference between what the Army could do for a wounded soldier and what a town could do for a wounded neighbor, has reversed so completely that the traffic now runs the other way. Battlefield medicine learns from American trauma centers, so here's what I'd like from you. That white paper worked because it counted something everybody had stopped counting. What are we absorbing into the background right now? The number we've all agreed not to look at. Tell me in the comments. I read them. And the next time you hear a siren coming towards somebody, remember what that sound used to mean. For most of the last century, in most of this country, the vehicle turning onto your street was a hearse, and the man driving it made his living on the other side of your outcome. The help you take for granted is barely 50 years old. It was invented, in large part, by men a city had thrown away. If you want more of these, the parts of American life that turn out to have a start date, subscribe and open the vault with us. There's another one waiting for you right here.